He caught her when she fell, but it was the kick from her unborn baby against his hand that truly broke him. When a pregnant widow is left for dead in the fury of a Wyoming blizzard, fate delivers her to the doorstep of a reclusive giant. He could save her from the storm, but could two broken souls, each haunted by the scars of their past, save each other and find a second chance at family? Stay with us for a story of survival, redemption, and a love that was born in the heart of winter. The grandfather clock in the hall of the Thorne residence chimed 4, each note a hammer blow against the oppressive silence. Eleanor Ellie Vance sat perfectly still on the edge of a stiff velvet armchair, her hands folded over the slight swell of her belly. Outside, the Teton Mountains stood like shards of glass against a bruised sky, their jagged peaks already vanishing into the swirling gray of an approaching blizzard. It had only been 3 days since she'd buried her husband David, and the cold that had settled in her bones had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. Across from her, Marcus Thorne, David's older brother, steepled his fingers. He had the same dark hair as David, but none of the warmth. His eyes were chips of granite. "The estate is settled, Eleanor," he said, his voice as crisp and sterile as a legal document. "The Thorne legacy is, and will remain, secure." Beside him, their mother, Beatrice, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She wouldn't look at Ellie. "David was impulsive," she whispered, her voice thin and frayed by grief. "He never truly understood the weight of his name." Ellie found her voice, a fragile thing in the cavernous room. "This is my home. David wanted this child to be raised here." Marcus leaned forward, a predator sensing weakness. "David isn't here," he cut in, the words sharp as splintered ice. "And his absence has raised certain questions. Necessary questions about the future, about your condition." He let his gaze drift pointedly to her stomach, and the implication was as vile as it was unmistakable. "We can't be certain the child is a Thorne. A year of marriage is hardly a lifetime." The accusation stole the air from Ellie's lungs. It was a lie forged in greed, so cruel and calculated that she couldn't form a defense. David had been her world, the gentle, laughing man who had convinced a music teacher from Philadelphia that she belonged among these harsh, beautiful mountains. Now, that world was being dismantled before her eyes. "You can't do this," she finally breathed, one hand instinctively protecting her unborn child. "It is already done," Marcus declared, rising to his full height. He gestured to a small worn carpet bag by the door, her bag, packed by a maid she didn't recognize. "You will be given a stipend. A pittance, really, but more than generous under the circumstances, enough to get you back to wherever it is you came from." Beatrice stood as well, her movements stiff, as if pulled by her son's strings. "It's for the best, dear," she murmured, the words hollow. "To protect what's ours." Ellie looked from the cold, imperious man to the broken woman beside him. She saw no family, no solace, only the closing of a tomb. They were erasing her, erasing the love she and David had shared, as if it were a footnote in their grand family history. Numbly, she rose, took the bag, and walked toward the heavy oak door. She didn't beg. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As she stepped onto the porch, the wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, whipping snow into her face. The world beyond the manicured grounds of the Thorne estate was a churning vortex of white. The storm had arrived. With a final, resonant click, the door shut behind her, sealing her out of the life she had known. She was alone, with nothing but a few dollars, a ghost of a memory, and the secret life growing within her, facing a blizzard that threatened to swallow the world whole. The world had dissolved into a blind rage of wind and ice. Each step Ellie took was a guess, her thin city coat, a useless shield against the storm's fury. The Thorn estate had vanished behind her, and the 5-mile trek to the town of Jackson was an impossible dream. Pride and heartbreak had driven her out into the blizzard, but it was the fierce, desperate kick from within that kept her moving. "I have to survive for you," she thought, the words a silent prayer. But her legs grew heavy, numb blocks of ice that no longer obeyed. The darkness at the edge of her vision began to close in, and with a final ragged sigh, she surrendered, collapsing into a deep snowdrift that felt as soft and final as a grave. Miles away, Caleb "Cal" Blackwood leaned into the wind, his broad shoulders braced against the gale as he checked his fence line. His horse, a steady old gelding named Anchor, stood patiently, its coat already thick with snow. This was a man's work, a familiar rhythm of post and wire that kept the ghosts at bay. 3 years he'd lived this way, in the silence of his Solitude Creek ranch, speaking more to his horse and his dog than to any human. Then, through the swirling white, he saw it, a mound of snow that didn't belong, a splash of dark color against the endless white. He moved toward it, his long legs eating up the distance. It was a woman. His mind registered it with a distant shock, but when he knelt and brushed the snow from her face, he saw the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath her thin coat. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. A ghost of a memory, sharp and jagged, tore through the careful walls he'd built around his heart. Another woman, another child, another future lost to a cruel twist of fate. For a frozen moment, he was back in the wreckage of that rodeo accident, helpless. But the woman in the snow was real, and she was dying. A raw, protective instinct he thought had died 3 years ago roared to life. He shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapping it around her small, still form. She weighed almost nothing as he lifted her into his arms. He carried her back to Anchor, mounted with a strength born of desperation, and urged the horse toward the faint, welcoming light of his cabin. He shouldered his way through the door into the welcome heat. An old man with a face like a weathered map looked up from the hearth, his eyes widening. "God almighty, Cal. What did you find?" "Get blankets, Silas." Cal's voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse and emotion. "And heat some water. Now." The old ranch hand moved without another word, his gruff demeanor melting away into efficient concern. Cal laid Ellie gently on the worn sofa before the fire, his massive hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped his coat from around her. He saw her pale, serene face, the delicate line of her jaw, and the fierce, undeniable curve of her belly. He had rescued a stranger from the storm, but as he looked at her, he knew he had brought the ghost of his own past right back into the heart of his home. Ellie woke to the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was in a dream, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth that felt impossibly safe. The storm was a distant beast, its howling muted by the cabin's thick log walls. She was lying on a sofa, buried under a mountain of heavy wool blankets. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting flickering golden light across the rustic room. This was not the Thorn residence. This was not her life. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked up at the man standing a few feet away. He was enormous, a silhouette carved from mountain granite, his shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the firelight. It was the man from the storm. He held out a steaming mug, his expression unreadable. "Broth," he said. The single word was a low rumble, deep and gravelly. Silas made it. She struggled to sit up, her body aching with a profound, bone-deep chill. "Where?" she began, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin. You were in the snow." He placed the mug on a small table beside her and retreated back to the far side of the room, as if her presence scorched him. He offered safety, but not comfort. His silence was a wall, his grief a palpable thing that filled the space between them. Over the next hours, Ellie drifted in and out of a weary sleep. The old man, Silas, would appear periodically, checking on her with a gruff nod before vanishing again. But it was the giant who dominated the space. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his size, stoking the fire, mending a piece of tack, his back almost always turned to her. He was a guardian, but also a ghost, haunting the edges of his own home. During a moment of clarity, her eyes scanned the room, searching for clues about her silent rescuer. The cabin was Spartan, masculine, built for purpose, not comfort. And then she saw them, arranged on the heavy wooden mantelpiece like relics in a shrine. The first was a silver rodeo buckle, once ornate, now bent and snapped in two, its polished surface dulled as if by a great fire. It spoke of a violent, shattering end to a dream. Beside it stood a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of a laughing woman with eyes the color of a summer sky, her hair wild in the wind as she sat atop a horse. There was so much life in that image, so much joy, that it made the silence in the cabin feel 100 times heavier. Ellie looked from the broken buckle to the vibrant, lost woman, and then across the room to the solitary man staring into the flames. In that instant, she understood. His silence wasn't anger, it was a scar. It was the sound of a heart that had been hollowed out, a pain so profound it needed no words. And in his wounded quiet, for the first time since David's death, she felt a flicker of something other than her own bottomless grief, a deep, aching kinship. The storm passed, leaving the world a pristine, silent wilderness of white. For 2 days, Ellie did little more than rest, eat the simple meals Silas left for her, and watch the quiet, wounded giant who moved through the cabin like a ghost. But on the 3rd morning, a sliver of sunlight pierced the frost on the window pane, and with it, a piece of her own spirit stirred. Tucked away in a far corner, almost completely hidden by shadow, she saw it. An old, upright piano, its dark wood covered in a fine layer of dust. It was a relic from another time, a forgotten vessel of joy. She looked toward Cal, who was methodically oiling a saddle near the fire. He didn't speak, but he saw where her gaze had settled, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission she needed. Using a soft cloth she found in a dry sink, she began to clean the keys, her touch gentle and reverent. Each wipe of the cloth felt like an act of waking something, or someone, from a long sleep. She sat on the worn bench, her fingers hovering over the yellowed ivory. Then she began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, fragile things, like the first tentative steps after a long illness. The piano was out of tune, but it didn't matter. She played a simple, melancholy folk song her mother had taught her, a tune that spoke of loss, but also of the quiet endurance of the human heart. The melody filled the cabin, weaving a tapestry of sound through the heavy silence, chasing the shadows from the corners. It was the first time she had touched a piano since David's death, and in the music, she found a voice for the grief she could not speak. Out in the barn, Cal was mending a split fence rail, the familiar work a comfort to his restless hands. He heard the first notes drift from the house, faint and thin on the cold, clean air. He froze, the wood planes slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the packed dirt floor. It couldn't be. He stood motionless, his head cocked, as the melody grew stronger, more confident. It was Laura's song, the one she would hum while she gardened, the one she'd asked him to learn on the guitar. It was the soundtrack to a life he had buried. He didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there in the barn's cold stillness, the scent of hay and leather filling his lungs, and let the music wash over him. Each note was a sweet agony, a memory unlocked, a feeling he had ruthlessly suppressed for 3 long years. He didn't go back to the house. He just listened, as the ghost of a melody from a stranger's hands began to slowly, painfully bring the heart of his desolate ranch back to life. The music had changed the texture of the silence. It was no longer an empty, suffocating void, but a quiet space that held a shared understanding. That evening, as Silas served a simple dinner of venison stew, the old man cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his plate. "Man deserves to know the name of the woman sleeping under his roof," he said, the gruff words a clear instruction. Ellie looked at Cal, who for the first time met her gaze directly. "Eleanor Vance," she said softly. "Ellie." Cal nodded slowly. "Caleb Blackwood." "Cal." He looked at the broken buckle on the mantelpiece, his jaw tight. "That was from the Cheyenne Rodeo, 3 years ago." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if pulling the words from a deep, painful well. "The rigging on the bull failed. It went over the barrier. My fiancée, Laura. She was standing right there. We were expecting a boy. The stark, unadorned tragedy of it hung in the air." Ellie's heart ached for him, for the sheer, brutal randomness of his loss. In his story, she heard the echo of her own. "My husband was David," she found herself saying, the words coming more easily now. "A fever took him in 2 days. His family. They waited until the funeral was over. They said I wasn't worthy of his name. They said they couldn't be sure." She trailed off, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Cal's eyes, full of his own ghosts, now held a new emotion, a fierce, quiet anger on her behalf. "They left you in that storm," he stated, not as a question, but as a judgment. In that moment, they were no longer just a rescuer and a victim. They were 2 survivors, adrift in the same boat, having lost the same precious cargo. A partner and the unborn child who was their future. The next afternoon, the crunch of tires on snow announced a visitor. A stout man in a sheriff's uniform stepped onto the porch, his breath pluming in the cold. "Cal," he said, his voice warm and familiar, as he stamped the snow from his boots. "Good to see smoke from your chimney." "Sheriff Brody," Cal acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. He introduced Ellie simply as a guest. She was caught in the storm. The sheriff's eyes were kind, but observant. He tipped his hat to Ellie. "Ma'am, glad to see you're safe. Cal's a good man to have on your side in a blizzard." He turned back to Cal, his expression growing more serious. "Just making rounds. Word is, Marcus Thorne has been asking questions in town, making some ugly noise. I thought you should know." He didn't press for details, but the warning was clear. He was an ally. After Brody left, a new silence settled between them. But this one was different. It was the quiet of 2 people who now knew the weight of the other's past. The world outside was still cold and dangerous, and Marcus Thorne was a threat looming on the horizon. But inside the small cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, they had forged a fragile, unspoken alliance. They were no longer entirely alone. A quiet rhythm had settled into life at Solitude Creek. The days were marked by simple routines: the crackle of the morning fire, the shared, mostly silent meals, the steady work that was the only real medicine for a wounded heart. Ellie, feeling her strength return, insisted on helping. She swept the floors, mended a tear in one of Cal's flannel shirts, and organized the pantry. Her small acts of domesticity, a gentle push against the cabin's bachelor austerity. Cal never objected, watching her from a distance with an unreadable expression in his deep-set eyes. One evening, she was putting away a sack of flour Silas had brought from town, trying to hoist it onto a high shelf. Reaching up, the weight of the baby shifted, and a sudden wave of dizziness caused the world to tilt sharply. Her grip on the shelf faltered, and with a small gasp, she stumbled backward. Before she could fall, he was there. He moved with a speed that defied his immense size, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, steadying her, while his other hand instinctively came to rest on the small of her back. She was flush against his chest, her head resting just below his shoulder, and she could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. She was safe. The thought was absolute, and in that moment of profound security, it happened. The baby, who had been quiet all day, gave a sudden, powerful kick. It was not a flutter, but a solid, definitive thump, a declaration of life against his calloused palm. A jolt, visible and sharp, went through Cal's body. His breath hitched, and his hand, which had been a point of support, was now frozen in place. A conduit for a miracle he never thought he would feel again. His eyes widened, staring down at the spot where his hand rested on her dress, as if he could see the impossible movement beneath the fabric. All the pain, all the loss, all the ghosts of Laura and the son he never held, coalesced into that single, shocking point of contact. Ellie looked up at his face and saw not the stoic, grieving giant, but a man completely undone, his defenses shattered by a simple, innocent kick from a child that was not his. They stood locked in that silent, breathless tableau for a long moment, the space between them charged with the impossible current of life. The wall of his grief had just been breached, not by words or by music, but by the undeniable, insistent touch of a new beginning. The moment after the kick had changed everything. The air in the cabin was now charged with a new awareness, a fragile intimacy that both of them were too afraid to acknowledge with words. A tentative hope had taken root in the silent spaces between them, but their sanctuary, forged in a blizzard, was never meant to last. The outside world, with its cold and calculating cruelties, was coming for them. It arrived on horseback a few days later, in the form of a man with a hard face and impatient eyes, who reined his horse to a stop just beyond the porch. He was not a neighbor. Silas, who had been splitting wood, rested his axe, his posture stiffening with suspicion. "Got a message for the woman," the rider said, his voice carrying a note of insolent challenge. He didn't dismount. "From Mr. Marcus Thorne." Cal emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his sheer size an immediate and imposing answer to the rider's arrogance. He moved to the front of the porch, placing himself between the stranger and the cabin door, where Ellie had appeared, her face pale. "I'll take it," Cal said, his voice flat and cold. The rider smirked, handing over a thick, sealed envelope. He held Cal's gaze for a moment too long before wheeling his horse around and galloping away, leaving a spray of muddy snow in his wake. Inside, Cal broke the wax seal with his thumb. The silence in the room was absolute as he read the legal document, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. Ellie watched his jaw clench, his knuckles turn white where he gripped the paper. "Cal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it?" He finally looked up, his eyes blazing with a protective fire she hadn't seen before. "It's from Thorne's lawyer," he said, his voice dangerously low. "He's spreading lies in town, calling you a fortune hunter, saying I'm holding you here against your will." He took a deep, steadying breath, the paper crinkling in his fist. "This is a formal demand. He's petitioning the court for legal guardianship over you and the baby, citing your fragile emotional state. He wants you back under his roof until the child is born, to protect the Thorne family's rightful heir." The words struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow, and she swayed on her feet. The cabin, her warm and quiet shelter, suddenly felt like a cage. Marcus had found her, and the storm he was bringing was one of fire and lies, a storm designed to rip her child from her arms and leave her with nothing once again. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a polished black buggy, utterly out of place in the rustic landscape, crunched to a halt in the yard. Marcus Thorne stepped out, his city clothes a stark insult to the rugged terrain. Beatrice followed, her face shrouded by a veil, a specter of grief and disapproval. Cal met them on the porch. He had told Ellie to stay inside, but she stood just behind the screen door, her presence a silent statement that she would not hide. Silas stood near the woodpile, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, a silent, weathered sentinel. "This farce has gone on long enough, Blackwood," Marcus began without preamble, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are here to take my sister-in-law home. This is a family matter. This is her home now." Cal's voice was a low, steady rumble, as immovable as the mountains at his back. "She's not going anywhere." Marcus's lips curled into a sneer. "You are a washed-up rodeo rider living in a shack. You have no claim here. We have the law. We have the means." "What you have," Cal interrupted, taking a single deliberate step forward, "is a pregnant woman you threw out into a blizzard. A story Sheriff Brody found mighty interesting." The mention of the sheriff gave Marcus a moment's pause. He looked past Cal to the screen door, his eyes locking on Ellie. "Eleanor, stop this foolishness. You are a Thorne. You will act like one and return with us. It is your duty." Ellie pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, her fear eclipsed by a wave of maternal fury. She stood beside Cal, her small frame dwarfed by his, but her voice was clear and strong. "My only duty is to my child, Marcus, a child you tried to disown. I will not let them be raised in a house filled with such coldness." For the first time, Beatrice lifted her gaze and truly looked at Ellie. She saw not the usurper her son had described, but a young woman, fiercely pregnant, being sheltered by a man whose quiet decency was as plain as the mountains behind him. She saw the undeniable truth of a coming grandchild. Doubt, swift and painful, flickered across her face. "Marcus," she began, her voice faltering, "perhaps we should—" "Listen." "Listen to what?" Marcus snapped, his composure cracking at his mother's hesitation. He saw he had lost this skirmish. His power of intimidation was useless against Cal's quiet strength. "This is not over," he spat, his face a mask of rage. He practically herded his mother back into the buggy. As they rode away, Ellie leaned against the solid frame of the cabin, her legs trembling. They had won the battle, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Marcus Thorne would not rest until he had won the war. The victory in the yard felt hollow. Marcus Thorne's threats echoed in the quiet that followed. a promise of a legal war they were ill-equipped to fight. Cal grew even more silent in the following days, a thoughtful, brooding presence that seemed to be wrestling with a difficult decision. Then one morning, he brought the wagon to the front of the cabin. "There's something we need to do in town, Ellie," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The ride was tense, the unspoken threat from the thorns shadowing them under a cold, grey sky. Cal didn't lead them to the general store or the doctor's office. Instead, he stopped before a small, unassuming building with a faded sign that read, "Alistair Hemlock, Attorney at Law." Inside, the air smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. A balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from a mountain of books. "Caleb," he said in surprise. "It's been a long time." "Mr. Hemlock," Cal nodded, gesturing for Ellie to take a seat. He stood before the lawyer's desk, his hat in his hands, looking as out of place as a great bear in a library. "I need a document drawn up." The lawyer peered at Ellie over his glasses, his expression professionally neutral. "What sort of document?" "A partnership agreement," Cal stated, his voice steady and clear. "I want to deed a portion of the Solitude Creek Ranch, including the cabin and surrounding pasture, to be co-owned by myself and Ms. Eleanor Vance, with full residency and survivorship rights." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The lawyer looked just as stunned. "Cal, that's a significant decision. Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Cal said, his gaze unflinching. "Cal, no," Ellie whispered, finding her voice. "I can't accept that. You don't have to do this." He finally turned to her, and for the first time, she saw not just a protector, but a strategist. His eyes were full of a fierce, intelligent resolve. "This isn't a handout, Ellie. It's a foundation. Thorne thinks he can crush you because you have nothing. He thinks he can paint you as a destitute woman I'm taking advantage of." He looked back at the lawyer. "This gives her a legal home. It gives her standing. It makes her a landowner in this county. Now you tell me if Marcus Thorne can walk over a woman like that." It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the world understood it. It was something deeper, more practical, and infinitely more profound. It was a fortress built of ink and paper, a shield forged in a lawyer's dusty office. As she watched him sign the document, his signature strong and sure beside her own trembling one, Ellie knew that this quiet, wounded giant was offering her more than just a home. He was offering her a future, and he was willing to stake his own name and his own land to defend it. The legal document had bought them a fragile peace. Marcus Thorne was forced to regroup, his war of intimidation temporarily stalled. In the quiet weeks that followed, a sense of home began to truly settle in the cabin. The impending birth was a constant, hopeful presence, a future they were both cautiously beginning to believe in. They had planned for Doc Miller to make the trip from town when the time came. But the Wyoming winter, like the Thorns, was not yet finished with them. It started with a sharp, unexpected pain that made Ellie gasp and grip the edge of the kitchen table. Another followed soon after. It was too early. A sudden, late-season squall had blown in from the north, dumping a foot of wet, heavy snow in just a few hours, making the roads impassable. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way into Ellie's heart. Cal saw the look on her face and acted instantly. He got Doc Miller on the town's new telephone line, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to the static. The doctor's words were grave. "I can't get through, Cal. The pass is completely blocked. You're going to have to deliver it." The words hung in the air, a sentence for the man who had once been rendered helpless by fate. But this time was different. This time he was not a bystander. He looked at Ellie, her face pale with pain, but her eyes filled with a desperate, absolute trust in him. That trust was an anchor. "Tell me what to do, Doc," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. What followed was a primal, desperate battle fought in the warm confines of the cabin. The world narrowed to the space around the bed. Silas became a silent, efficient force, keeping the water hot and the linens clean. Cal, with the doctor's voice a lifeline in his ear, became Ellie's rock. He was no longer the silent, grieving giant. He was a tower of strength, his low voice guiding her, his steady hand supporting her, his presence an unwavering shield against the pain and fear. He faced down the ghosts of his past with every command he followed, every word of encouragement he gave. Hours blurred into an eternity of effort and exhaustion. Then, just as the storm outside began to lose its fury, the cabin was filled with a new sound, a sound more powerful than the wind, more resonant than any music. It was the strong, clear, indignant cry of a healthy baby. At that exact moment, the clouds broke, and a single, brilliant ray of sunset pierced through the window, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. Cal, his hands trembling, wrapped the tiny, squirming infant in a clean blanket and placed her on Ellie's chest. A girl. She was perfect. Tears streamed unashamedly down his face as he looked from the miracle in Ellie's arms to the impossible light filling the room. "Hope," Ellie whispered, her voice choked with tears and relief. He nodded, unable to speak, as he gently touched the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. In the dying light of the storm, in the heart of their shared ordeal, hope had been born. The cabin was transformed. The arrival of hope had filled the silent corners with soft gurgles and the gentle creak of the cradle Cal had placed by the hearth. The quiet, wounded giant had melted in the presence of the tiny infant. Ellie would watch him, mesmerized, as he'd let the baby's impossibly small hand wrap around one of his massive, calloused fingers, a look of profound wonder on his face. The ghosts of Solitude Creek had not vanished, but they had retreated, making space for a new, vibrant life. A few weeks after Hope's birth, the last of the winter snows had finally melted, and the world was alive with the promise of spring. One evening, after Ellie had nursed the baby and settled her into the cradle, she found Cal sitting by the fire, holding a small, polished wooden box in his hands. The usual quiet between them felt different tonight, charged with a gentle gravity. He looked up as she approached, his gaze soft in the firelight. "Ellie," he began, his voice a low, serious rumble. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a glittering diamond, but a simple, unadorned band of gold, worn smooth by the passage of time. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father gave it to her the day they were married, right here on this land. She never took it off, not for 47 years. He looked from the ring back to her, his heart in his eyes. "It's not fancy. It doesn't have a stone, but it's real. It represents a lifetime of hard work, loyalty, and love. The kind of love that builds things and lasts." He stood and took a step closer, holding the box out to her. The air grew still, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the baby in the cradle. "I know I'm not the man you chose, and this isn't the life you planned," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "But I've come to care for you and Hope more than I ever thought I could care for anything again. You brought this place. You brought me back to life." He took a deep, shaky breath. "Ellie Vance, will you make this our family for good and all? Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, tears of a joy so profound it washed away the last lingering shadows of her sorrow. She looked at the honest, loving face of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. She looked at the simple gold band. a legacy not of wealth or status, but of true and lasting partnership. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Oh, Cal, yes." They were married on a warm day in late July, when the Wyoming sun filled the valley and the scent of pine and wild roses hung sweet in the air. There was no church, no procession. Their chapel was the shade of a great cottonwood tree in the yard of the ranch, and their guests were the only family that mattered. Silas, standing beside Cal, looking uncharacteristically flustered in a clean shirt. Sheriff Brody and his wife, their faces beaming, and Doc Miller, who had insisted on giving the bride away, his eyes misty with fatherly pride. Ellie wore a simple dress the color of the summer sky, a stark contrast to the somber black she had worn for so long. In her arms, she held Hope, who was dressed in a small white gown made from the lace of Ellie's own mother's wedding veil. As she walked across the grass toward Cal, she remembered the first melancholy tune she had played on his dusty piano. The memory was no longer sad. It was simply the first note in a song that had, against all odds, resolved into a beautiful, harmonious chord. Cal stood waiting for her, his usual stoicism replaced by a look of pure, unbridled joy that transformed his rugged features. He was no longer the haunted giant who had pulled her from the snow, but simply a man watching his entire world walk toward him. The ceremony was short and sacred. The vows were not flowery promises, but simple, heartfelt truths spoken before the mountains that had witnessed their entire story. "You found me in the storm," Ellie said, her voice clear and steady as she looked into his eyes. "You gave me shelter, and you gave me a home. You are my home, Cal." When it was his turn, Cal took her hand, his large palm gently enveloping hers. "I thought my life was a closed book," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You and Hope, you turned the page. I promised to cherish and protect you both for all the days of my life." When the circuit judge, a friend of Doc Miller's, pronounced them man and wife, Hope let out a happy gurgle, as if giving her own blessing. A cheer went up from their small congregation of friends, and Silas slapped a beaming Cal on the back. Later, as they shared a meal laid out on trestle tables, and the sound of their friends' laughter mingled with the rustle of the cottonwood leaves, Ellie watched her husband hold their daughter. In the warm afternoon light, they were a perfect, complete picture of love and resilience. The melody of their life together was no longer a sad, solitary tune, but a rich and vibrant family symphony. Autumn had begun to paint the aspens gold along the creek when the past made its final, unexpected visit. A lone rider approached the ranch, not with the arrogance of a hired hand, but with a slow, hesitant gait. As the figure drew closer, Ellie recognized the straight-back posture of Beatrice Thorne, but the proud matriarch she remembered was gone. The woman who dismounted was humbled and haunted, her expensive riding habit unable to hide the profound weariness in her eyes. Cal moved to stand beside Ellie on the porch, his presence a silent, solid shield. Beatrice did not try to approach them. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, clutching a worn leather portfolio to her chest. "I am not here to make demands," she said, her voice thin and stripped of its former authority. "I am here to confess a sin." She looked at Ellie, her eyes swimming with a sorrow that was finally genuine. "Grief is a poison, Eleanor. I was drowning in it, and I allowed my son to make it my whole world. I let his bitterness and pride speak for me, and I was wrong." She opened the portfolio and drew out a single sealed letter. The handwriting on the front was achingly familiar. It was David's. "Marcus kept this from me, from everyone," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. David wrote it the day after you told him you were pregnant. He left it with his lawyer to be given to you in the event of his death. With trembling hands, Ellie took the letter. She opened it and read the words of the man she had loved. It was a testament of pure joy, a love letter not just to her, but to their unborn child. It spoke of his dreams for their family, his unwavering love, his pride. And at the end, it legally and explicitly bequeathed his entire personal inheritance, a substantial trust fund separate from the Thorne estate, directly to her and their child. It was the final, irrefutable truth, a voice from the grave that silenced all of Marcus's lies. Ellie looked up, tears blurring her vision. Beatrice had not moved. "I don't ask for your forgiveness. I have no right," the older woman whispered, "and I will not ask for a place in your home. But I am a grandmother. And David, he loved you so much." She finally broke, a sob escaping her lips. "I only ask that someday you might find it in your heart to let me see my son's child." Ellie looked at Cal, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, leaving the decision entirely to her. She looked down at the letter, a final gift from her first love, and then thought of the new life she had built from the ashes of that loss. "She deserves to know all of her family, Beatrice," Ellie said, her voice full of a grace she didn't know she possessed. "The ones who love her." It wasn't a promise of immediate welcome, but it was a door, once slammed shut, now left slightly ajar. A year passed, and autumn returned to the valley, not with the threat of a blizzard, but with the gentle grace of a harvest fulfilled. A new sign, carved by Cal's own hands, now stood at the entrance to the long driveway. It read, "Blackwood Vance Ranch." It was a declaration, not just of a name, but of a legacy forged in the heart of a storm. From the porch, Ellie, now heavy with their second child, watched as hope took her first wobbly, determined steps across the grass. The little girl, with David's dark curls and Cal's steady blue eyes, was a perfect, beautiful fusion of their pasts. She toddled on her sturdy legs from her mother's outstretched arms into the waiting, gentle hands of her father. Her laughter, the purest sound in the world. Beatrice had visited, as promised. The meetings were quiet, weighted with unspoken sorrows, but sweetened by hope's innocent joy. A fragile bridge was being built, one hesitant visit at a time, a testament to Ellie's capacity for grace. The letter from David and the independence it provided had been a final, healing gift, allowing Ellie to forgive from a position of strength, not need. Cal came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, where their new life was growing. She leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest, feeling the profound peace of belonging. Inside the cabin, on the mantelpiece, 2 new silver frames stood beside the laughing photo of Laura and the broken rodeo buckle. One held a picture of a smiling, handsome man named David Thorne. The other held their own wedding portrait. The past was not erased. It was honored, woven into the fabric of the family they had become. They stood together in the golden afternoon light, watching their daughter chase a butterfly. They were no longer 2 solitary souls, haunted by the ghosts of what they had lost. They were a family. Around them the land stretched out, peaceful and promising, ready to support the dreams they would build. Winter was coming again, but they no longer feared it. Here, in the shelter of each other's arms, they had found that the deepest roots of love often grow in the soil of the deepest sorrows, blooming into a life more beautiful than they had ever dared to imagine. And so, From the heart of a winter storm, a new family was born, a quiet reminder that even after the deepest loss, the seeds of hope can find a way to grow. If their story of survival and second chances touched your heart, I have a simple request for you. Don't worry about typing out a long comment. Just leave the number 1 below. It's a quiet way of letting us know that this story found a good home with you tonight. Our book of stories is far from closed. We have so many more journeys to share. Tales of ranchers, pioneers, and quiet heroes who discover that the greatest frontier is the one within the human heart. To make sure you're with us for the next tale, do me the honor of hitting that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. We're grateful to have you with us. Until next time.